didn't look like criminals. They looked like men you would pass on the street without a second thought. A martial arts instructor, a toy gun collector, a safecracker obsessed with blueprints, a quiet mastermind who studied human behavior like a scientist. But in January 2006, this ordinary-looking group would pull off what Argentina would later call the heist of the century, and they would do it without firing a single bullet. Yet inside the bank, for hours, dozens of hostages believed they were about to die. It began on a hot summer Friday in Buenos Aires, January 13th, just before closing time, when the Banco Rio branch in the suburb of Acasuso was full, customers finishing transactions, employees counting cash, security relaxed in the routine of the day. Then the doors opened, for men walked in, calm, controlled, armed. Within seconds, the illusion of normalcy shattered. Everyone on the floor, the weapons looked real. The voices were steady, no panic, no rush. This wasn't chaos, this was choreography. 23 hostages were forced to lie face down, employees were tied up. The vault area was secured. The robbers moved with eerie confidence, as if they had rehearsed this moment 100 times. Because they had. Outside, alarms were triggered. Police flooded the streets. News helicopters began circling overhead. Within minutes, the entire neighborhood was sealed. The police thought this was a standard hostage robbery. They were wrong, very wrong. Inside the bank, something strange was happening. The robbers weren't asking for money. They weren't demanding vehicles. They weren't negotiating. Instead, they were waiting, talking calmly, offering water to hostages, cracking jokes, playing psychological games. One point, they handed a note to a negotiator that read, "In the neighborhood of thieves, stealing from a thief is 1,000 years of forgiveness." It sounded philosophical, almost poetic. But what the police didn't understand was this: the real robbery wasn't happening inside the bank. It was happening underground. Weeks earlier, the mastermind had rented a small property just blocks away. A normal house in a normal street. Neighbors saw nothing unusual. But beneath that house, a tunnel had been quietly carved. Through dirt and concrete, a tunnel leading directly under the bank's vault, measured, timed, engineered with frightening precision. While police focused on the hostage situation upstairs, 2 members of the crew were calmly inside the vault below, opening hundreds of safe deposit boxes. They weren't stealing cash from drawers. They were stealing the private fortunes of the wealthy. Jewelry, dollars, gold, heirlooms, secrets, locked away by the elite of Buenos Aires. By the time the police realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Hours passed. Negotiations stalled. Then suddenly, the robbers vanished. Police stormed the bank, expecting gunfire. Instead, they found terrified hostages, empty hallways, and a single toy gun left behind. The vault had been cleaned out, and the robbers had disappeared into the city. Through the sewer system, calmly rowing away in inflatable boats. No shots fired, no injuries. Millions gone. Argentina had just witnessed a crime so bold, so theatrical, that many people didn't feel anger. They felt admiration. But this story wasn't over, because months later, one mistake, one betrayal would unravel the perfect crime, expose the men who had almost gotten away with it forever. For weeks after the heist, Argentina was obsessed. News channels replayed the footage. Newspapers printed diagrams of the tunnel. Talk shows debated one question over and over: how did they do it? The police had nothing. No fingerprints, no clear faces, no vehicle to trace, no witnesses who could identify anyone. Just a toy gun and a note that sounded like a riddle. Inside the bank, investigators walked through the vault in disbelief. Hundreds of safe deposit boxes had been opened with surgical precision, not smashed, not forced. Opened. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't luck. This was engineering. The tunnel became the obsession. Investigators traced it from the bank to the rented house blocks away. They found tools, dirt piles carefully hidden, ventilation pipes, lighting systems. This had taken months. Patience like this didn't belong to impulsive criminals. It belonged to planners, thinkers, people who treated crime like a science, and that terrified the authorities because it meant these men were still out there, calm, quiet, watching the news like everyone else. Then the first crack appeared, not from police work, from a relationship. One of the robbers had a partner, a woman who knew more than she should have. She had listened to late-night conversations, seen nervous behavior, heard details that didn't make sense, and eventually, after an argument, she walked into a police station. She didn't bring evidence. She brought a name. Fernando Araujo, a quiet martial arts instructor with no criminal record, a man who seemed incapable of something this bold. But when investigators began digging into his life, the pieces started aligning in a way that made their skin crawl. Araujo had rented the house near the bank. He had an unusual interest in architecture, vault systems, and psychology. He had friends with very specific skills, a locksmith, a mechanic, a man obsessed with replica firearms, an all-star crew. Suddenly, the impossible crime had faces. Police surveillance began. Phones were tapped, movements tracked, conversations recorded, and what they heard stunned them. The men weren't scared. They were proud, laughing about how the police had negotiated with them for hours. While they were already underground in the vault, they joked about the toy gun. They spoke about the safe deposit boxes. Like collectors discussing rare art, they believed they had outsmarted the system forever. And in many ways they had, because the money and valuables, mostly gone, hidden, sold, scattered. Recovering it would be nearly impossible when arrests finally came. Pendry watched in disbelief. These were not hardened criminals. They were intelligent, soft-spoken men who looked like neighbors, teachers, fathers. During interrogation, they didn't deny it. They explained it, almost proudly, as if they had pulled off a masterpiece and wanted credit for the design. They described the tunnel, the timing, the rehearsals, the psychological manipulation of hostages and police. One officer later said they didn't talk like thieves. They talked like artists describing a painting. But the deeper investigators went, the darker the story became. Because while no one inside the bank was physically harmed for hours, hostages believed they would be executed. Some developed trauma that lasted for years. Children had nightmares. Employees never returned to work. The robbers had created a perfect illusion of danger to buy themselves time. And that illusion had real consequences. Argentina was divided. Were they criminals or folk heroes who stole from the wealthy and embarrassed the police? Public opinion leaned in a direction no one expected. Many people admired them. They had exposed weaknesses in the system, humiliated authority, taken millions from anonymous vaults without spilling blood. But the law saw it differently, and prison was waiting, yet even in custody. One truth remained: this crime had been too perfect, too intelligent, too theatrical. And there were still parts of the plan the public didn't know, parts that showed just how long these men had been preparing, how close they had come to getting away with it forever. By the time the case reached court, Argentina already knew the story, but they didn't know the details, not the disturbing level of preparation, not the months of quiet rehearsal, not how deeply these men had studied human fear, because this wasn't just a robbery, it was a psychological operation. Fernando Araujo, the mastermind, had spent years studying bank layouts, police response times, and most importantly, how people behave under stress. He knew something most criminals ignore. People don't think clearly when they're afraid, and fear can be manufactured without violence. Inside the bank, every movement had been designed to create the illusion that the robbers were unpredictable and dangerous. They shouted at the right moments, stayed silent at others, moved hostages without explanation, made them lie face down so no one could track their positions. They created confusion because confusion buys time, and time was the only thing they needed. Investigators later discovered notebooks filled with sketches, timing charts, and behavior notes. How long before panic sets in, how negotiators speak, how police set perimeters, how long before tactical teams arrive. They had rehearsed scenarios like actors preparing for a play. Even the toy gun had a purpose. It reduced legal risk if things went wrong, but from a distance. It looked real enough to keep everyone obedient. They never intended to shoot. They intended to control. The tunnel, too, was a masterpiece of patience. They dug only at night, removed dirt in small amounts, disguised. Noise installed air pipes so they wouldn't suffocate underground. They even practiced navigating the sewer system weeks before the heist, mapping routes like explorers. This wasn't desperation. This was obsession. During testimony, one of the hostages spoke about the silence, not the shouting. The silence. She said the most terrifying part was when the robbers stopped talking for long stretches of time. No footsteps, no voices, just the belief that something terrible was about to happen. She later learned that during those silent periods, the men upstairs were doing nothing at all. They were simply waiting, while their partners below emptied the vault. The fear had been staged, but to the hostages, it was real. As details emerged, public fascination grew even stronger. Movies were proposed, books were written, journalists dissected every step. The robbers had turned crime into theater, and the courtroom into the final act. They didn't act ashamed. They acted reflective, almost philosophical. One of them reportedly said, "We didn't hurt anyone. We just exposed how fragile the system really is." But for the victims, the trauma was not philosophical, it was personal. Years later, some still refused to enter banks. The sentences came, prison time for each member of the crew. But even then, the legend of the heist only grew. Because the truth was undeniable. They had outsmarted the police for months. They had executed a plan so precise that it felt fictional. And if not for one emotional betrayal, they might never have been caught. Yet there was one final layer to the story. One final twist that made investigators uneasy. Because when they reconstructed the timeline, they realized something chilling. The robbers had actually finished emptying the vault long before. Negotiations ended. They had stayed inside the bank longer than necessary, not because they had to, but because they wanted to be absolutely certain the illusion held. They were playing a role, and they enjoyed it. That detail changed how many people saw them, not just as clever thieves, but as men who discovered how easily fear could be controlled, and how dangerously satisfying that control could feel. The heist had been perfect, but the psychology behind it was what truly disturbed those who studied the case, and that would shape how Argentina remembered them forever. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about stolen millions, it was a story about manipulation, patience, and the thin line between brilliance and something much darker. Years passed, prison sentences were served, appeals were filed. Some of the men were released earlier than the public expected, and something unusual happened. They didn't disappear into shame. They became legends, interviews, documentaries, books, even a feature film inspired by the heist. People wanted to hear the story from the men who had done the impossible, and they were willing to talk, calmly, intelligently, almost proudly. They explained the plan in detail like engineers reviewing a completed project. No rage, no desperation, no excuses, just method. Fernando Araujo especially spoke about the heist as if it were a philosophical experiment. He claimed the goal was never violence, it was to prove that intelligence could defeat force, that patience could outmatch weapons, that the system people trusted every day had blind spots no one wanted to see. To some, he sounded thoughtful, to others deeply unsettling, because he spoke about fear the way a scientist speaks about chemicals, something measurable, controllable, predictable. The public debate never really ended. Were they criminals? Of course. But were they also symbols of rebellion against banks, wealth, inequality, and authority? Many Argentinians thought so. The fact that they targeted safe deposit boxes, private fortunes hidden by the wealthy made the story feel less like theft and more like a statement. Even though, legally and morally, it was still a crime and the victim still existed. Psychologists later studied the case not for the robbery itself, but for the behavior. How four men managed to hold dozens of people in place for hours without firing a shot. How tone of voice, posture, silence, and timing created total obedience. How the human brain reacts when it believes danger is near. The heist became a case study in control, a lesson in how easily perception can be shaped. But perhaps the most haunting part of the story was this: if the relationship had not fallen apart, if no one had spoken to police, they might never have been caught. There were no forensic clues strong enough to identify them, no eyewitness who could describe them. Clearly, they had escaped through water, erased their trail, and blended back into normal life. Perfect crime had been undone not by law enforcement, but by emotion. Today, the Banco Rio branch still stands. People walk past it every day without realizing they are passing the site of one of the most extraordinary crimes in modern history. A crime where no one died, no one was shot, and yet, for hours, everyone inside believed death was only seconds away. Illusion was the real weapon. The Great Buenos Aires bank heist is remembered not just because of the money taken, but because of what it revealed. How fragile security can be, how powerful planning can be, and how fear, carefully engineered, can control dozens of people without a single act of violence. In the end, the robbers didn't just steal millions, they stole something else. They stole the sense of certainty people had about safety. And that is why this story still feels unsettling even years later. Because it forces one final question: what is more dangerous? A man with a gun or a man who understands exactly how your mind works?